Are you wondering which bonsai soil will be best for your trees? In this video, I'm going to talk about the bonsai soil basics that you need to be aware of in order to choose the very best substrate that you can find in your area for your bonsai trees. Do stay tuned until the end though, because I'll point out a couple of special cases that we'll need to consider. Oh, and if you're new to my channel, consider subscribing, ring the bell, and you will get notifications each and every time I bring out a new bonsai video. If we're just meeting, I'm Darren George, and my channel is all about bringing you inspiration and information as I grow my trees through the seasons. Before we can choose a new bonsai soil for your trees, we first need to understand a few of the basic requirements that trees have of their substrate. So, the things that a tree requires are support, so that the tree doesn't fall over. Although we don't really need to worry about that, it's kind of given whichever substrate we choose. And a tree also needs water. The tree roots also need air, or specifically oxygen. And the tree roots also need access to nutrients that we provide via fertilizers. Actually, drop me a comment down below if you only just learned that tree roots need oxygen. A tree can grow in just about any substrate as long as it's not toxic. Out in the wild we can find trees growing in clay, sand, rocks, its own leaf mold. The same is true for the trees that we grow as bonsai as well. So the most important factor that we need to get right to ensure that our trees are as healthy as they possibly can be is a balance between water and oxygen. This is because the air that contains oxygen and water just don't mix. The amount of water and oxygen that's available to the tree's roots is dependent on three factors. The first factor is how much water a particle of the substrate can absorb. The second point is the size of the substrate particle. And the third factor is how frequently water is applied to the pot, whether that be from us watering or indeed from the rain. So why is so much emphasis placed on choosing the quote-unquote correct bonsai soil? The reason is because pots behave differently to the ground. In the ground, a tree can send out its roots further and further until it finds the soil conditions that allow it to get the most water, oxygen and nutrients that it requires. Obviously in a container, particularly a small bonsai pot, a tree can't do this. We have to ensure that the conditions are as good as they can be by managing the substrate. And another factor is that due to surface tension and fluid dynamics that I'm not going to go into for the purposes of this video, a pot creates its own little water table, so that after watering, the water table inside the pot will rise, and as the soil dries out and water evaporates, the water table drops again, and this happens each time water is applied to the pot and is allowed to dry. Now the ground also has a water table, but it's much more stable than what we see in a bonsai pot because it takes a lot more rain to make the water table rise, and also, relatively speaking, the water table is lower in the strata compared to the depth of one of our bonsai pots. This means that trees growing in the ground can adapt to where that water table typically sits. Again, in the bonsai pot, a tree can't do this because it fluctuates so wildly and it's such a small, shallow container. A moment ago I mentioned that trees out in the wild can grow in just about any medium, and the same is true for traditional potting mixes. The trouble with the traditional potting mixes is that the absorbent materials within the substrate do soak up a lot of water, and the particles tend to be quite a small size. These two factors combined means that the substrate stays wet for much longer than we would like in a bonsai container. So in order to ensure that the roots get the oxygen that they need, we have to be very, very careful in controlling how often the pot is watered. If we water too frequently, the soil or the substrate will stay too wet for too long, and there won't be enough time for air to penetrate the soil and for the roots to get the oxygen that they need. On the other hand, if we don't water frequently enough, what can happen is the soil dries out too much, and it then becomes hard to get the substrate wet again so that the roots can get enough water. Each example causing an imbalance in the water and oxygen in the substrate. Okay, so now we've got a really good idea about the problem that we're trying to solve around bonsai soil. Let's talk a little bit about the approach that you can use to find the best substrate for your trees in your area. Oh, and do let me know in the comments below if this is making sense so far. I'd be really, really interested to hear from you. Okay, before we can make an informed choice about how to make changes to the substrate that we're going to use, first we need to consider a few reasons why we would like to change the substrate in the first place. Because if it's not broken, we don't need to fix it. 3 good examples that I would look for that would make me think that I need to make a change to the substrate are, first of all, drainage is really, really poor. I apply water to the pot, it takes an absolute age to pass through the pot. If it's taking something ridiculous like a week between waterings and the weather isn't particularly wet, then I'm going to start to think, hey, you know what, this substrate just isn't giving me the right balance between water and oxygen. It's too wet. Another really good reason to consider changing the substrate is that things have progressed beyond just a simple observation of the drainage or the amount of time it takes for the substrate to dry, and actually we're seeing genuine symptoms of water stress in the tree. A good example that I've got at the moment is a Scots pine that I'm working on. I noticed that when the autumn rains arrived this autumn, the ends of the needles of the tree started to go brown. That's a sure sign that the substrate is just staying too wet and something needs to be done. On the flip side though, a clue that the balance of water and oxygen is in the favour of oxygen, so that there's not enough water in the system, is that the substrate drains super fast, which is a good thing on its own, but we're finding that we have to water the tree multiple times a day to prevent it from fully drying out, maybe even to prevent it wilting, even if the weather isn't particularly hot. So we water the tree, the water goes whoosh straight through the pot, comes out the holes, and an hour or two later we go and have a wander around the garden and notice that the substrate of this tree is looking bone dry, like we have to water this right now. Same again, apply water and come back in a couple of hours and what do you know, it needs watering again. It's not particularly hot weather, something must be wrong. The tree is clearly using the amount of water that the substrate is holding on to so quickly that we have to water the tree more often than we can practically sustain. Although I said that a tree in a bonsai pot is going to be healthiest if it has a balance of water and oxygen, we do have some wiggle room to experiment, and experiment is exactly how we're going to find the best substrate for your tree, in your garden, in your climate. So as long as the substrate that we test and try out isn't toxic, we're actually not going to come to a great deal of harm trying something out and seeing how it goes. Let me explain. If we tweak our substrate and find that it still holds too much moisture, or it holds more moisture than it did before, more moisture than we would like, We can take measures to ensure that it doesn't stay too wet. We can water it less frequently, or we can put it somewhere where it is sheltered from the worst of the rain. On the other hand, if we open up the texture of our substrate and introduce some more non-absorbent inorganic components to the mix, we then find that actually we are in a situation where the soil just dries out so quickly, watering the tree would become more like a full-time job. But in that situation, again, it's not a disaster because we could position the tree out of the sun so that it doesn't dry so quickly, or we could top dress with more moss, maybe set up a sprinkler system in the short term just to make sure it doesn't dry out on those really hot days. What I'm getting at is we can tweak the mix, carry out some trial and error, and if we don't arrive at the absolute perfect mix first time, that's okay. You can start by asking yourself, how often do I generally need to water this tree? If you find that you're going a week between watering and the substrate just stays really damp the whole time, it'll be a good candidate for choosing an inorganic soil component that has a larger particle size than you're currently using and adding a percentage of that to the mix the next time you repot. On the other hand, if you're finding that you need to water multiple times a day, even though it's not particularly hot, then it would be a good idea to consider adding perhaps an organic component to the soil, or a component to the soil that does retain more moisture than the substrate you're currently using. But try not to worry, because there is literally no correct or perfect soil mix for any given situation. It just doesn't exist. You can just experiment, try different mediums until you find the best compromise for your trees in your garden and in your climate. A quick tip though, be aware that after you repot a tree, the tree consumes less water than a tree that has an established root system. So if you experiment with a new substance in your soil, don't make any snap judgments 1, 2, 3 days, a couple of weeks after the repot. Give it time to really re-establish that root system and then assess how frequently you're needing to water and how much water the tree is using. Okay then, what materials could we use in a substrate? The options for materials for you to include in your substrate is going to depend a lot on what's available in your country. So I've prepared a list of commonly used substrates that I'm aware of. Hopefully it might give you a little idea on what sort of thing to be looking for. For particle sizes, I try to stick to between 2 and 4 millimeter for my deciduous trees and 4 and 8 millimeter for my conifers, my pines and junipers. That's just a general ballpark guide though, it's not set in stone, so do feel free to experiment with whatever you can get in your country. Bear in mind though that if it's not broken, you don't need to fix it. If what you've got and what you're using is working for you, please don't change just because you heard that you should change or someone gave you some well-meaning advice. Change your bonsai soil because you have encountered a reason to change it or an issue that needs to be resolved. Don't just chop and change for the sake of it. If something works, stick with it. So what substrate am I using for my trees? For my deciduous trees, I'm using 80% molar clay and 20% bark chippings. And for my pines and junipers, I've got 90% molar clay and 10% bark chippings. I have found, as I mentioned earlier, that the conifer mix that I'm using at the moment is staying a bit too wet, more wet than I would like. So in the next couple of seasons, I'm going to be experimenting with pumice and also an expanded clay component called leca, both of which are less absorbent than the materials that I've got at the moment. As I said, the Scots pine has shown signs of water stress. So to remedy that, over the wet season this winter, what I've done is I've constructed a makeshift shelter that consists of a couple of pallets and some clear polythene over the top. I've placed the tree under that shelter. I do have to remember to water it from time to time so it doesn't completely dry out, but that's absolutely done the trick. Okay, so at the start of the video, I did mention that there are a few caveats or special cases that I need to mention. The first gotcha is Satsuki azaleas, or indeed rhododendrons in general. I don't grow them myself, but I'm told that they have very fine root systems and they also need an acidic soil pH. So I'm told that Canuma is the #1 substrate for those guys. The second gotcha is common junipers, Juniperus communis. Again, I'm told that they do not like Akadama, so if you're going to be growing common juniper, might be wise not to try Akadama with those guys. Finally, if you do have some highly refined trees in your collection, it might just be wise to err on the side of caution and do any experimenting on some less valuable material before you go chopping and changing your valuable collection. Just have fun, experiment, hit the thumbs up if you found this video useful. If you thought that this was literally the worst video in the world, it was terrible, you hated every second of it, hit the thumbs down. If you want to get notifications when I bring out the next video, click subscribe and ring that bell. And if you've got any questions, please do write in the comments below and I will do my best to answer every single one. Thanks for watching.